Hey, welcome back. This is the second and hopefully final part of the Chapter 11 PowerPoint presentation on selecting a topic for your speech and kind of doing some pre-writing. And we talked about pre-writing a lot in the last slide. Or last part of this. We talked about some different approaches to pre-writing that you can use and how you can use them to get some ideas and develop some ideas for your speech. So now we're going to talk about assessing your audience and what I mean by that. So this should be a familiar term by now, but when you're assessing your audience, you want to look at the whole rhetorical situation, which is a fancy term for the circumstances where you and the audience coexist. It includes you, the audience, and the occasion or exigence, which is the reason you're giving the speech. We talked about that in the speech basics a little bit more, so we won't really go into a whole lot of detail about it. That right there right now. So when you're assessing your audience, you want to think about things like age, education level, sex, occupation, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, religion, geography, language, and any previous subject knowledge. So while you don't want to, marginalize or stereotype your audience, you do want to take into consideration these characteristics. You might give a different speech for someone who's 15 than you might give to someone who's 50. Or you might give a slightly different speech to a Christian audience rather than an Islamic audience, or a Hindu audience, or a pagan audience. You might adjust the language in your speech and handle it differently for speakers of native English versus those who maybe speak English as a second language and might not have as much of an understanding of the nuances or common phrases used in English. So these are the kinds of things you want to take into consideration when you're assessing your audience to kind of customize your speech to their needs. And that'll make them more likely to listen to you. You also want to examine the occasion and expected purpose of the speech and where it's given by asking yourself some questions. So what is the intended purpose of the speech? How long should it be? Where will it be given? When will it be? And is there any equipment needed? So for the speeches in this class, I'll tell you how long it should be, so you won't really need to guess at that. The intended purpose will be the prompt. Where it will be given, well, that's really up to you, probably at your house in front of your computer. And the equipment is going to be some sort of video recording equipment where I can hopefully see you and hear you delivering the speech. But out in the real world, you may not be given such strong guidelines for this kind of thing. So you'll actually have to ask yourself those questions. So then we want to get to customizing your topic for the audience. So we want to look back at your initial list of ideas and your pre-writing, and then choose the topics that will be most relevant to them. That will be of greatest interest to them, that can be covered in the allowed amount of time, and are appropriate for the demographic data that we discussed earlier. So you wouldn't want to, say you have a 1-minute introduction speech. Well, you don't want to talk about a very complicated issue in that 1 minute because you're just simply not going to have time. And if you run over, then the next person isn't going to have their time. So you definitely want to keep time in mind when you're giving speeches. It's a really important guideline to use, and it's one of the reasons that I actually do count off for it if you go over or under, because it is really important to keep in mind. So then you want to customize your topic for your audience, and you want to avoid two things, and I kind of briefly mentioned those earlier: marginalizing and stereotyping. Marginalizing is ignoring the values, needs, interests, and subject-specific knowledge of audience members, and stereotyping is assuming that all members have similar knowledge, behaviors, or beliefs because they belong to a similar group. So marginalizing might be, let's say you have a group who's primarily elderly. Maybe you're giving a speech at a nursing home. And you talk about Pinterest and social media. Well, they may not be particularly interested in that. They might, but they might not have a whole lot of previous knowledge about it. So marginalizing would be assuming that they already know a lot. And stereotyping would be assuming they have no interest in it at all, or that their interest is very limited. So you wouldn't want to give a speech on that. Or that they're all like terrible at tech because they're older. You want to kind of avoid those two behaviors, and it's a very fine line to customize your speech and avoid those at the same time. So it's okay if you have a little trouble with it at first. It gets easier with time. In other words, customize your topic for your audience, but avoid making assumptions about them as much as you can. So then crafting a goal statement. So a general goal statement is the overall intent of the speech. So persuasive, demonstrative, narrative, things like that. Example, I want to write an informative speech about sexism. Then you have a specific goal statement, which is very similar to a thesis statement, contains one idea and includes the anticipated audience response. An example might be, I want my audience to understand the 3 main consequences of sexism in the workplace to generate discussion on this important issue. So your main idea is the 3 consequences of sexism in the workplace, and the audience response is to understand and generate discussion. So this specific goal statement goes into a lot more detail, and this would also work as a thesis statement in your speeches. They're very similar. The main time when you want a difference between a goal statement and a thesis statement would be when you're using this general goal statement. I want to create an informative speech about sexism, then you might want to follow that up with a thesis statement to make it more specific, like in the specific goal statement. So before writing a speech, the kind of main steps you want to take are to select a general list of topics, assess the needs of your audience, customize your topic and goal for that audience, and then craft a goal statement. And that brings us to the end of the Chapter 11 PowerPoint presentation set. And then I'll come back in a few minutes and I'll record the Chapter 12 one, which is more about organizing your speech and goes into more detail about some of the things we talked about in the speech basics. So I'll see you guys in a few minutes.